All right. Thank you so much for the presenters for their great presentations. So now we'll take the next 20 minutes or so for a Q&A period. So any folks who are on our session, let's see who we have here. We have about 110 folks. Thank you for joining us for this session. So yeah, we'll take any questions now. As I mentioned, we'll get you to pop those into the Q&A function. All right, it's very challenging to
So we created our own.
Sorry, that's the player is a little, there's a little lag here. Anyways, yes, it's a little difficult to manage both the chat and the Q&A. So if you do have specific questions, please put them into the Q&A function for us. So our first question is from Blessy, who asked, where can we access the 2022 toolkit from? So that's a question for Esther that she already answered. It will be posted on Civita's website at www.civita.ca. Anything to add to that, Esther, or are we good?
No, I thought it'd be easier to put that one in the chat just so everyone had the link.
Perfect. Yep, thanks for that. Another question from Blessy also. What data collection platform are you currently using re-coordinated access? So I think that's for our Durham folks.
Sure, Alex, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, so we transitioned our by name list onto Hypus in July, I think. And then we spent a couple months, basically up until this month, really working on balancing our data again. Just from the transition, it took a little bit of work on the back end. All that credit goes to our data coordinator, Monica. So she's been working really hard to get our data balanced for Built for Zero again, and just making sure that everything is up to date and that the transition went smoothly. So now we're pretty much fully on Hypus. Our data balances again, so we're good to go right now. But yeah, as Erin mentioned, we do have our pre-Hypus implementation guide when we were on Excel for about a year. And now we have our post-Hypus implementation guide as well.
Awesome. Okay, thanks for that. So I'm just going to pick up on a question that was thrown in the chat earlier during Esther's presentation. A comment from a friend of mine, Matthew Ward in Edmonton with Homer Trust. Yeah, just about, resilience is hard enough to build in good circumstances. But of course, during a pandemic, when we're all communicating virtually and some of us haven't seen our teams in weeks or months, it's especially challenging. Do you have any feedback or advice for folks on how to overcome the challenge of communicating virtually?
Sure, and hello to you too, Matt, since we are in the same region. I would say we have been working remotely since March of 2020 and so have also gone through those growing pains. One of the things that we've tried to do is have sort of non-work related gatherings so that the staff can all come together and sort of still feel like a team. But I think this is also where to pay attention to both the individual resiliency pieces as well as the organizational one. And I think it's easy when we're online to really focus on the individual because that's the person who's like right in front of you, and we don't always think about the organizational level when we're not all under the same roof necessarily. So it's just keeping track of both of those pieces and doing a check-in. And that's where we came up with this survey tool because we thought that it would be good to hear back the feedback from people in the organization, both where they were feeling themselves, but also where they thought the organization was at. And then again, to have, intentionality towards it. So resiliency doesn't just happen. You need to make sure as an organization that you're putting the effort towards it.
Awesome. Yep, for sure. So question here from Jessica. I think this could go to any of our presenters. What advice do you have regarding balancing leadership and incorporating feedback? It's a tough one, hey?
Sorry, I'm just making sure I'm off mute. Sorry, having some technical challenges. So sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, what advice do you have regarding balancing leadership and incorporating feedback?
So we try to get regular feedback from the leadership in our homelessness sector. And one of the tools that we found helpful is the Reaching Home the Leadership Enhancement Workbook. I think Stephanie mentioned it in one of her slides. So we found that tool really helpful to get feedback on how our system is working from a lot of different stakeholders. And then we would receive the survey responses and code them for key themes. And we now have a master document that has all of those key themes and answers to all of those questions. And we're using that document to help inform our 2022 project planning. So that's kind of an easy, consistent, and standardized way to get that feedback. And then another way of doing it that we found helpful is just talking to the leaders and the different organizations participating in our homelessness support system. We're pretty lucky here in Durham that our support system is big. We do a lot of work, but it's not so big that we don't know personally who is providing all of the services in our community. So just having those informal conversations, you can kind of sometimes get the best feedback that way.
Awesome. Anyone have anything else to add?
Sure. I'll just say from within an organizational perspective, I think it's really important to think of feedback as positive, and that it's what you want to hear as you're going through and sort of carrying out your role as a leader, because that's how you're going to be able to determine whether or not the transformation that you're doing is going to be as successful as you're hoping that it will be. And I would say that balance, the feedback sometimes isn't as helpful, or people don't like the direction that the transformation is taking. And I would say that if you're getting that kind of feedback, or if you're getting sort of some negative pieces sort of thrown at you, that you still show that people have been heard. That's usually the big piece that one needs to overcome, and then have an answer for it. And so keeping that feedback and those feedback loops open. And so it's not just feedback from sort of staff to leadership, but also leadership to staff, so that there's an equal sharing of information and a feedback loop, as well as people feeling like they all understand each other.
Awesome. Thanks, you both. Anything else to add to that, anyone?
Just from a coordinated access perspective, I think being transparent with what we know we need to have to meet certain requirements, and then what within that we can be flexible with. So for example, we knew we needed a prioritization criteria when we started to approach that conversation. For our community, it made the most sense to have 3 for 3 populations, so youth, family, and single adult. So that's where we could go to the stakeholders for each of those sectors and really approach them as the experts in those areas and get their feedback. So we can say, this is what we know we need to do, and then also present it to them as an opportunity to have their voices heard. So I think knowing what you need to have and standing ground with that, but then also being flexible with what within that you can bring the experts in and have their voices heard. So I think that's something that we really tried to do within our organization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an excellent point, because most of us probably here on this call are Reaching Home communities, funded through the Reaching Home by the government of Canada. And yeah, there's certain parameters that we have no choice. And I mean that in a good way, because a lot of the time these are best practices regarding an end to homelessness. So there's certain areas where, yeah, you just want to kind of keep that consistent. And then, yeah, like you said, Alex, there's areas where there is kind of room for improvement or room for experimentation. Absolutely. Okay, what do we have here? Question from Carrie. For the organization resiliency system transformation work, what was the context of the research that you did? Was it an intentional research project, or was it something that evolved? So over to Esther for that one.
Yeah, actually, this one we created as a research proposal for one of the CMHC callouts for research. So Savita has an embedded research unit that I lead in it, and so we're very lucky to be able to live in this sort of research academic world while also being embedded in an operational area. So this was very much an intentional research project from the get-go. It did, of course, evolve as we were going through it. It started before the pandemic, and then the pandemic hit, which made us have to pivot in terms of recognizing the degree to what we wanted as engagement from the sector, that people just didn't have that level of time or the resiliency, so the bandwidth and things like that. But it also underscored even more so the importance of this kind of work. And so we started off with just making sure we had some clear sense of what the literature said about all of these different terms. And so that's where it started. And then we sort of put it all together and then worked towards the toolkit.
Awesome, thanks. Okay, now we have a question for Durham. Were all agencies on board coordinated access in a shared environment in HIFIS or any other shared environment, I guess?
Sure, I can start and then I'll hand it over to the team. So I guess, so in our community, and I'm certain this isn't unique to us, we spent a lot of time talking about coordinated access and shared information and shared clients and all before we ever started actually doing anything about it. And we started first years prior by implementing HIFIS 4. So we had the previous version of HIFIS here where every agency was using their own installation of it. And so moving to HIFIS 4 is kind of when we started having those conversations about the importance of somebody only needing to share their story once, having consistent data, providing wraparound supports for clients. But it did take us probably about a year of having those conversations to get everybody at the table and on board. I think everybody bought into the idea kind of like on this like up here kind of level, but then when you start talking about the practice of it and sharing data and sharing information and shared consents and all of those things, it can take a little bit of time. But I think what we found most helpful is just having those constant check-ins with your community and with the people that are going to be participating, is having those informal conversations on what do you really think about it. Sometimes in a meeting environment, people aren't as comfortable voicing any apprehension or concerns that they have. So checking in with everybody and doing those anonymous surveys to kind of monitor the temperature of how your project is going is really, really helpful. I don't know if my team wants to add anything.
Yeah, I think all I would say about the surveys is SurveyMonkey is one of our best friends at this point. So it was very valuable.
Anything else to add there, Durham?
Yeah, I think Erin pretty much covered it, and Stephanie definitely with the SurveyMonkey. Yeah, for us, like Erin said, we spent a lot of time talking about it. And so in our presentation, we really tried to stress the mentality of failing forward, which is something that we embraced from Built for Zero. We started our by name list. We had 5 access points to start with, people who were on board with us. And then we wrote one policy, and then we would bring it back to the team and then write more. So it was really just about building the system. And once people could actually see it in practice, it helped people understand what it was. It helped us understand what it was, and really start to keep building it. Like now we have 10 access points. We have a variety of housing opportunities attached to the by name list. So once we could really show the community what it was in practice, that was really helpful for building the will in the community.
Absolutely, yeah. Thanks for that. So next question is for Esther. What do you think is the most important or crucial thing that we need to keep in mind as teams undergo change management or systems transformation?
I think there's sort of 2 key things. One is knowing the why of the transformation, and making sure that the explanation of the why is not just so high level that it seems just esoteric, but also talking about what it means at every level of the organization. So, you know, the person who is doing sort of the frontline work or like entering data, you know, they still have questions about what that transformation means for them. Is their job going to change? Do they still have a job going forward? You know, depending on the nature of the transformation, a lot of them are IT related right now. So that tends to be top of mind. And so I think just being able to really articulate the why and the change that will be actually occurring and making it real for everybody in the organization so they can all see themselves also in the change.
Excellent. Another question for Esther, is the research being published outside of the toolkit?
Yes, so we do have a larger literature review, which we've also now turned into a draft academic article. We just haven't determined which journal we're going to be submitting to it yet. So we can share that once it's been submitted and accepted for publication.
Okay, great. That's awesome. Okay, we have about 6 minutes left before we have to move on to our next session. So yeah, feel free to keep the questions coming in the Q&A. In the meantime, yeah, I have a question for you folks that kind of ties together both of your presentations because of course they're coming from different texts. Through the course of the pandemic, yeah, like Esther spoke to, resilience is so important. Yet sometimes, it feels like a lot of folks during the pandemic were like, okay, it's time for me to start to, like, I've had enough of this, frontline is too hard, or I'm worried about bringing something home to my kids, or my partner's immunocompromised or whatever. And sometimes what we saw is that the people who were left ended up having to shoulder even more of the burden as a result of that. So, I mean, that obviously has an impact because, of course, you have to have more resilience, but also can create feelings of, I don't know, resentment or whatever. Like, how did you address that? Like, Esther, how would you address that from a resilience standpoint in Durham? I'd be interested to hear if anything like that affected you, and if so, how did your staff cope with it?
Oh, that's a good question. We were lucky enough that we had in 2019 transformed all of our records into digitized records, which was a fight in itself because it was a transformation that created some very different conditions for people's day-to-day work. But then when the pandemic hit, it made it a much better transition to people being able to work from home. So we immediately within a week got everyone a computer. They were working from home. We weren't in the office, but they still could access all of the same file information that they would have been otherwise if they were in the office, being able to access paper. And I think that really made a huge difference because we had focused on something that would be really transformational and useful for the day-to-day, rather than just always thinking of it from like a really high sort of strategic level. And then also just huge flexibility. So, we had some people who, because their kids are at home, needed to be able to work around partner schedules and kids schedules. So able to do that, taking care to really talk to those who were still on the front line and meeting with people face to face about PPE and feeling safe enough to do that, and sort of working with them if they weren't. And so we didn't have as many people leave, luckily, throughout that. And I think part of that was because we were so intentional about making sure that our staff were okay throughout the transition. We did lots of check-ins, lots of sort of forums in terms of, we had a monthly town hall where staff were then kept up to date on what things were happening, decisions that were being made, and had time to ask whatever questions that they had on a more formal basis. But then also just Teams became really helpful because people could have running chats and chats with their respective teams or colleagues. And so that I think really helped us focusing on keeping those relationships, so people also didn't feel really isolated now working from home.
Awesome. Thanks, Esther. Durham.
I think the only other thing I would add to all of that is we're seeing the impacts kind of now more than ever, and especially frontline staff in particular, staff on our housing outreach side of things. The housing market is more challenging than it's ever been. The rental market is more challenging than it's ever been. The level of need is steadily increasing. So we are starting to see that now. So we're having conversations about how can we rethink the role of housing outreach now in our community. So can we completely redefine how we do housing outreach? So that's an improvement project that we're going to be starting next month, and checking in with all of our housing outreach frontline agencies to say, can we start testing out things? Because we know that staff are feeling burnt out and they feel like they have an impossible job, which isn't fair to them and isn't fair to people that are seeking help. So I think just having that ability to kind of quickly pivot, and again, using a PDSA cycle to kind of help you test out different changes and see if they're going to have an impact, is the direction that we're going in.
Thanks for that. Anything to add, Stephanie, Alex?
We also were working on our team's project plan for 2022. And so one of the things that we did just to, again, get that feedback from our community partners was hold like small work plan meetings with different sectors of our system. So the shelters, as Erin said, the housing outreach, and then also our by name list access point, just to get their feedback on what they think is working well, that we should continue, what maybe isn't working as well, that maybe needs to be looked at as improvement projects. So just getting that feedback from community partners as to what they kind of want us to look at over the next year is also helpful, since none of us are like directly on the front line. So it just gives us a bit of perspective of what's going on and maybe what we need to look at in the next year. So that's something else that we found helpful.
Awesome. Well, that brings us up to time. So any closing thoughts from any of our presenters? Anything you want to leave our attendees with this afternoon? All right. Well, I will just close it off by saying thank you to everyone for attending today. Great job from the presenters. It's certainly been a banner year in terms of learning about system transformation. So what do we say? You know, I mean, it might have been a crisis, but we'll make an opportunity out of it for sure. So for folks on the call, I'll indicate that Tanya Talaga's presentation will begin in about 15 minutes at 12:30 p.m. Eastern time. So you can just refresh your browser again if you want to get the latest updates on, because the system will prompt you to where to go next. So thank you all again. Nice to see you presenters. Thanks to all the attendees. Take care. Enjoy the rest of the conference. Bye now.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.